In the spring of 1455, England stood on the edge of collapse. The once proud kingdom, forged in centuries of conquest and war, now trembled under the weight of weak kings and restless nobility. Across the rolling hills and cobbled towns, whispers of discontent had become shouts of anger. Families with royal blood plotted behind closed doors, while the common people, burdened by taxes and losses abroad, murmured their frustration in market squares and taverns. It was a kingdom not just divided, but unraveling. For decades, the House of Lancaster had held the crown. Henry VI, a king of gentle disposition and scholarly mind, now occupied the throne, but he was a man ill-equipped for the turbulent currents of power around him. His reign had been marked by fragility, by a growing sense that authority itself had become optional. His court was crowded with ambitious nobles, each eager to secure lands, titles, and influence. Every gift of royal favor, every grant of power, was a spark in a tinderbox. The fragile balance of loyalty and authority that kept the kingdom intact was beginning to crack. The roots of this crisis stretched back further than Henry's personal weaknesses. England had emerged from the 100 Years' War exhausted, its treasury drained, its military campaigns faltering. Normandy had slipped from English hands, and France, once a stage for triumph, had become a theatre of retreat and humiliation. Even Henry's closest advisors were not immune to the temptations of power. Rival factions jockeyed for position, their disputes tangled in bloodlines, claims, and old feuds. At the center of this storm stood two men whose rivalry would ignite the flames of civil war: Richard, Duke of York, and Edmund, Duke of Somerset. York was a man of experience and ambition, with a legitimate claim to the throne through descent from Edward III. Somerset, meanwhile, wielded the king's favor and a tenuous authority built on past service and loyalty. Between them, the realm would soon fracture. By May 1455, tensions had reached their breaking point. Small skirmishes and feuds that had simmered for years boiled into open confrontation. The northern families, particularly the Nevilles and the Percys, took sides, their local rivalries now intertwined with the national struggle for power. London itself had experienced riots and rebellion, most notably the upheaval led by Jack Cade just 5 years prior. That uprising had been suppressed, but its echoes lingered in the minds of nobles and commoners alike, a reminder of how quickly public discontent could erupt into violence. The kingdom's undercurrent of instability was no longer subtle. It was a visible, palpable threat. The stage was set in the town of St. Albans, where the first decisive clash of what would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses would unfold. Here, the armies of York and Lancaster would meet, not in sprawling fields of battle, but in the narrow lanes and marketplaces of an English town. The violence would be sudden, brutal, and intimate. Archers and men-at-arms clashed amidst the streets, the sound of swords against armor echoing off the stone walls. The weak Henry VI, ill-prepared and vulnerable, would watch from the sidelines, a king in name but powerless in deed. In the chaos, the Duke of Somerset fell, struck down by the very men who had once pledged loyalty to the crown. It was a small engagement in numbers, but monumental in consequence. With Somerset dead and Henry captured, the Yorkists claimed a precarious victory, and the kingdom itself seemed to teeter on the edge of a long, bitter descent. England in 1455 was not a land of orderly governance or secure succession. It was a land where power could shift with the fortunes of a single battle, where allegiance was conditional, and where the ambitions of men with royal blood could ignite decades of strife. The conflict that would consume families, displace citizens, and rewrite the history of the nation had begun, quietly at first, but with an inevitability that no one could now deny. In the narrow streets of St. Albans, the first shots of the Wars of the Roses rang out, and a kingdom that had known centuries of conquest now entered an age defined by civil war, uncertainty, and the bloodied pursuit of the crown. The stage was set, the players in position, and the road ahead would be long, treacherous, and unforgiving. The blood of princes and the ambition of nobles were about to shape the fate of England for decades to come. From this moment, the struggle for the throne would be relentless, a dance of intrigue, rebellion, and battlefield slaughter. For the people of England, and the kings and queens who sought to rule them, nothing would ever be the same again. By 1455, England's throne was occupied by a king who seemed incapable of holding the kingdom together. Henry VI was a man of gentle intellect, devoted to prayer and scholarship, but the world he inherited demanded ruthlessness and clarity of purpose he could not summon. At just 33 years old, he carried the weight of centuries of royal ambition, yet his mind and will were fragile. The authority of the crown, which should have been absolute, was little more than a veneer. Decisions faltered in the council chambers, policies were implemented haphazardly, and nobles began to interpret indecision as weakness. In such a climate, ambition and treachery thrived. Henry's difficulties were both personal and structural. He had inherited a kingdom exhausted by war and mismanaged by previous regents. The 100 Years' War had left English claims in France weakened, and the treasury was nearly empty. Henry's minority had been guided by a council of nobles whose rivalries had never been resolved. His uncles, Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, had clashed for decades, their disputes spilling into national politics and leaving a kingdom unable to respond cohesively to crises abroad or unrest at home. Even when Henry reached adulthood, he failed to assert himself. His court became a stage for factional conflict rather than governance. The king's incapacity was compounded by his temperament. Henry was pious, sensitive, and withdrawn, a ruler who recoiled from violence and confrontation. He hesitated where others struck decisively. When confronted with threats, he deferred to favorites or advisors, often choosing loyalty over judgment. His generosity meant to secure support, instead fueled resentment. Nobles who received lands and titles grew powerful enough to challenge royal authority. Those overlooked felt humiliated and embittered. The crown was no longer the center of power. It was a prize to be manipulated. Henry's weaknesses were painfully apparent in foreign policy. Normandy and other French territories had slipped from English control during his reign, due in large part to indecisive leadership. Commanders sent to fight the French often lacked resources, reinforcements, or guidance, and Henry's oversight was inconsistent at best. In France, English soldiers fought without clear direction. At home, the nobility jockeyed for influence, exploiting the king's passivity. The result was a kingdom in limbo, a monarch in name but not in function, and a society where the bonds of loyalty were increasingly transactional. This inability to command created a vacuum that would ultimately drive the country towards civil war. Henry VI's weakness invited challenges not only from external enemies but from within his own extended family. Richard, Duke of York, viewed the crown not as a symbol of moral authority but as a seat that must be actively defended. York's claim was compelling. He was a descendant of Edward III, with bloodlines linking him to the Lancastrians and a closer generational proximity than Henry himself. The Duke's ambitions were fueled by frustration at the king's failure to govern effectively. Rebellions, such as Jack Cade's uprising in 1450, had already demonstrated the potential for unrest when the crown failed to enforce law and order. The Commons and MPs called for reform and looked to powerful nobles like York for solutions, but the king's indecision allowed factions to grow bolder. England was no longer a unified polity, it was a patchwork of competing authorities, with the king's voice increasingly irrelevant. Henry's personal failings also exposed him to manipulation. Queen Margaret of Anjou, ambitious and politically astute, would emerge as a dominant influence on the court. Her determination to secure the succession for her unborn son created friction with York and others whose claims or influence threatened her child's inheritance. The king's passivity allowed her to steer policy, appoint favorites, and antagonize rival factions, further destabilizing the realm. By the mid-1450s, it was evident that the throne could not, and perhaps would not, control the kingdom. Instead, the kingdom was shaping the crown around its factions and personalities. The consequences of Henry VI's inability to command were immediate. In 1455, the first skirmishes between Yorkist and Lancastrian forces erupted. The king's failure to assert leadership meant that these battles were not merely military engagements, they were contests of influence over the crown itself, where a decisive monarch might have mediated disputes, enforced law, and maintained order. Henry allowed personal ambition and factional rivalries to dictate the course of events. Each failure, each hesitation, widened the gap between the throne and the realm, setting England on a path toward decades of civil war. By the time York and Somerset faced one another at St. Albans, the crown had lost its authority. Henry VI, once the embodiment of royal power, was now a passive observer of events that would determine the fate of his kingdom. His indecision, his weakness, and his reliance on favourites had transformed the monarchy from an instrument of control into a symbol of vulnerability. The seeds of civil war, sown by a combination of historical circumstance, personal incapacity, and ambitious rivals, were ready to sprout. England's crown could no longer command. It could only witness, powerless, as the country descended into the bloody conflict that would be known as the Wars of the Roses. The struggle for the English crown in the mid-15th century was not simply a battle of armies, it was a contest of bloodlines, claims, and the right to rule. The Wars of the Roses, as historians would later call them, were named for the emblems of the two opposing factions, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York. These symbols, simple yet powerful, represented far more than family pride. They were the banner of legitimacy, the rallying cry for supporters, and the visual embodiment of a kingdom divided. Beneath these roses lay centuries of contested claims, personal ambition, and simmering resentment that had been building since the reign of Edward III. The Lancastrians, headed by King Henry VI, traced their lineage through John of Gaunt, the third surviving son of Edward III. Gaunt's marriage into the House of Lancaster had secured vast estates, wealth and influence for his descendants, and through them the Lancastrians claimed the throne. Henry VI's right to rule, however, was tenuous. Though king by inheritance, his weakness left the crown vulnerable to challenges from anyone with a stronger claim or sharper mind. Henry's position relied on the support of loyal nobles and the continued acquiescence of a country weary from war. Without his personal authority, the legitimacy of the Lancastrian throne was constantly in question. Opposing the Lancastrians stood the House of York, represented by Richard, Duke of York. York's claim was complex but compelling. He was the grandson of Edmund of Langley, the fourth surviving son of Edward III, and through his mother, descended from Edward III's second son Lionel of Antwerp. By blood, York was closer to Edward III than Henry VI, though the kingdom had recognized the Lancastrian succession. This intricate web of genealogical connections meant that the Duke of York's supporters could argue, convincingly, that the crown of England rightly belonged to him. For the Yorkists, the struggle was not mere ambition, it was a defense of what they saw as the true line of succession. The rivalry was not purely legalistic, it was deeply personal and political. The two factions were composed of powerful families, each with their own agendas, allies and grievances. The Nevillers of the North, one of the most influential families in England, aligned with York. They were motivated by both loyalty and self-interest, seeking to expand their influence at the expense of the Percys, their long-standing rivals who sided with the Lancastrians. In the south, the royal household was dominated by Somerset and other Lancastrian supporters who sought to maintain the king's authority while keeping York at a distance. These alliances transformed family disputes into national crises. England's political landscape was now a patchwork of feuds, ambitions and factional loyalties, all converging on the throne. The symbols of the roses themselves came to carry extraordinary weight. The Red Rose of Lancaster was more than a floral emblem. It was a reminder of dynastic continuity and the perceived legitimacy of Henry VI's rule. The White Rose of York represented challenge, reform, and the assertion of an alternative claim. When these roses were worn on banners, armor, and clothing, they marked the wearer as an ally or enemy, signaling political intent in a country where words alone were no longer sufficient. The visual symbolism of the roses allowed ordinary soldiers and nobles alike to navigate the shifting allegiances, providing a tangible guide in a world of intrigue and betrayal. The tension between the two houses was fueled by a series of missteps and misfortunes that left the Lancastrians vulnerable. Henry VI's indecision, combined with poor governance and military failures in France, weakened the monarchy. Normandy had been lost, royal finances were in disarray, and resentment among the nobility was rising. In this environment, York's claims gained traction. He was seen as competent, experienced, and decisive, the antithesis of the fragile Henry VI. Supporters of reform, both within Parliament and among the common people, began to see York as a solution to the chaos, a man capable of restoring order and reclaiming lost territories. Yet the Yorkist rise was not inevitable. Somerset and the Lancastrians remained formidable opponents. They held the king's favour, controlled strategic positions within the government, and could rally powerful families to their cause. The rivalry between York and Somerset was emblematic of the broader struggle. It was a contest of influence, strategy, and timing. Whoever could control the king or sway public opinion would shape the destiny of England. The first confrontation was inevitable, a clash not just of men but of dynasties, as centuries of succession disputes, personal grievances, and political failures converged into open warfare. This battle for the throne was also a war of perception. York's supporters emphasized his proximity to Edward III, his experience in governance, and his promise of stronger leadership. Lancastrians highlighted loyalty, continuity, and the sanctity of the current monarchy. Every move by either faction was carefully watched, analyzed, and judged. Mistakes were amplified, successes were celebrated as signs of divine favor. In this climate, symbols mattered as much as swords. The red and white roses were more than banners. They were the embodiment of a nation's divided loyalties, the visible manifestation of a kingdom teetering on the brink of civil war. By 1455, the stage was set for conflict. The roses were more than flowers, they were the stakes themselves. England's political, social, and military structures were entwined with these competing claims. The nation's future depended on the outcome of battles, the loyalty of nobles, and the fortunes of a king who could not command his own household. From this moment, England would be engulfed in a struggle defined by the clash of these two roses, a contest that would span decades, stain the soil with blood, and leave a legacy of intrigue, ambition, and tragedy. The crown could no longer sit securely on the king's head. It was a prize to be won, fought over and defended by every means necessary. The mid-15th century in England was a tinderbox, and all it needed was a single spark to ignite the flames of civil war. That spark came not in a grand dramatic moment, but in a slow accumulation of political, social, and economic tensions that had been building for decades. The Wars of the Roses did not erupt spontaneously. They were the inevitable consequence of mismanagement, weak monarchy, and competing claims to the throne. The roots of the conflict lay deep in history, extending back to the reign of Edward III, the 100 Years' War, and the succession disputes that followed. By the 1450s, the seeds of civil war had matured, waiting only for the right conditions to bloom into open conflict. At the heart of the instability was the crown itself. Henry VI, gentle and scholarly, was ill-suited to the turbulent demands of the English monarchy. A king's authority in this period depended on decisive action, political skill, and military leadership. Henry possessed none of these in the measure required. He was pious and sensitive, more comfortable with prayer than policy, with books rather than battle plans. His incapacity created a power vacuum at the center of government. Councillors and favourites scrambled to fill the void, but their competing ambitions only deepened the disorder. In the absence of a strong hand, the mechanisms of the kingdom began to unravel. Economic pressures compounded the political weakness. The English crown had been drained by decades of warfare abroad. The 100 Years' War had demanded enormous taxes, levied on a population already strained by social and economic hardship. Trade suffered, particularly in the wool and cloth industries, which formed the backbone of England's economy. Unemployment rose, wages fell, and unrest grew among the common people. The loss of Normandy and other French territories, once thought secure under Henry V, had demoralized soldiers and citizens alike, and it exposed the incompetence of the English government. Ordinary people began to question not only the king's authority, but also the ability of the ruling elite to protect the nation's interests. Factional rivalries among the nobility accelerated the kingdom's slide into chaos. Powerful families, each with their own claims, ambitions and grievances, competed for influence over the king and control of land. The Duke of Somerset, Henry's favoured advisor, sought to consolidate power and restore Lancastrian dominance, while the Duke of York, ambitious and capable, increasingly positioned himself as the saviour of the realm. These personal rivalries were intertwined with broader dynastic claims. York's bloodline provided a compelling alternative to the Lancastrian succession, and Somerset's loyalty to Henry VI represented the established order. Every dispute over titles, offices or estates became a potential flashpoint, and the Crown's inability to mediate disputes only exacerbated tensions. Public unrest played a crucial role in destabilizing England further. The common people, suffering under heavy taxation and economic mismanagement, were quick to challenge authority when opportunity arose. The rebellion led by Jack Cade in 1450 was a stark illustration. Cade's forces marched on London, demanding justice and reforms, accusing the King's Council of corruption and maladministration. While the revolt was ultimately suppressed, it revealed the depth of dissatisfaction and the willingness of ordinary people to take up arms when the system failed them. The rebellion also demonstrated the limits of the king's power. Henry VI could neither prevent unrest nor respond effectively to it. The weak crown and restless populace were only part of the problem. England's military failures abroad undermined confidence in the monarchy at home. Normandy had been lost, and other territories in France were slipping away, largely due to poor leadership and planning. York, observing these disasters from Ireland and later England, grew increasingly convinced that the kingdom required decisive action. He was not alone. Many nobles and members of Parliament shared his concern. The loss of French territories was more than a military embarrassment. It was a political crisis that eroded loyalty to the Lancastrian king and emboldened rival claimants. Legal and administrative grievances also fanned the flames. Nobles complained of arbitrary redistribution of lands and titles by the king and his favourites, creating a class of newly empowered lords with private armies of retainers. Established nobles saw their traditional rights and influence threatened, leading to private skirmishes and vendettas across the kingdom. These disputes were not isolated. They reflected a broader breakdown in the rule of law. When the king could not enforce order, the country fractured into competing spheres of influence, each governed by a powerful noble rather than the crown. Henry VI's marriage to Margaret of Anjou in 1445 added another dimension to the tension. Margaret was ambitious and politically skilled, determined to protect her son's succession and to secure power for her faction. Her presence in the court exacerbated factional divisions as she favoured allies who would support her and her child, further alienating York and other potential rivals. While the marriage brought no financial or territorial advantage, it significantly intensified political rivalries, drawing the crown into a personal struggle over the succession and the future of the monarchy. By 1453, these forces had converged. Henry VI's mental collapse after the loss at Castillon and the fall of Bordeaux created an unprecedented crisis. The king became incapable of ruling entirely, leaving England without a functioning sovereign. York, Somerset and other nobles stepped into the void, each seeking to assert authority. The country teetered on the brink of outright civil war. The divisions that had been building for decades, dynastic claims, economic pressures, noble rivalries, and a fragile monarchy were now impossible to ignore. The seeds planted in earlier reigns had finally sprouted. England was a nation fractured along multiple lines. The crown was weak, the nobility ambitious, the population discontented, and the military exhausted. The Roses of Lancaster and York were not simply symbols, they were emblems of a deeply divided kingdom. Each faction had its champions, its strategies, and its vision for the future. The stage was set for a conflict that would engulf the nation, devastate its people, and leave an enduring legacy of violence and political upheaval. Civil war was no longer a distant threat. It was inevitable. The kingdom's political, social, and economic structures had all aligned in ways that made compromise increasingly impossible. Every failed policy, every mismanaged campaign, and every personal rivalry added fuel to the fire. By the early 1450s, England was ready to erupt into the Wars of the Roses, a struggle that would last decades, claim countless lives, and reshape the monarchy forever. By 1453, the crown of England rested precariously on the shoulders of a man ill-equipped to bear it. Henry VI was not a weak king by intention. He was gentle, pious, and devoted to scholarship, but the violent, turbulent world of 15th-century politics demanded a ruler of decisiveness and strength. Henry's temperament and abilities, or lack thereof, transformed the throne from a symbol of authority into a fragile seat, swaying with every crisis. The nation, already strained by military defeats abroad and economic hardships at home, began to view the king not as a stabilizing force, but as a liability. His fragility left the kingdom exposed to ambitious nobles, fractious factions, and public unrest. Henry VI inherited the throne as an infant, less than a year old, after the untimely death of his father, Henry V. From the start, the monarchy relied on regents and councils to govern, creating a precedent for governance without a firm, singular authority. During his minority, powerful men such as Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, competed for influence, often clashing violently over policy and control. Gloucester, aggressive and militarily minded, advocated for continued campaigns in France, while Beaufort sought peace and consolidation. Their personal disputes, sometimes violent even within the halls of Parliament, revealed the cracks that would widen during Henry's adult reign. The crown, at its centre, was already unstable, and the seeds of future rebellion were sown in these early decades. Henry's own personality deepened this fragility. He lacked the charisma and tactical insight required to unite the kingdom. Where his father, Henry V, had been a military genius, Henry VI could not command loyalty through fear, respect, or admiration. Instead, he relied on favorites, often young or inexperienced, to advise and manage affairs. This reliance created resentment among established nobles who saw their power and privilege threatened. The marriage of Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou in 1445 brought temporary hope, but it also heightened the fragility of his reign. Margaret, a fiery and politically astute French princess, was determined to protect her husband's legacy and the succession of her future son. In a way, she became the kingdom's de facto power broker. Her intervention in court politics created further tension, particularly with the Duke of York, whose claim to the throne made him a natural rival. Henry, trusting Margaret's counsel, increasingly relied on her judgment, often to the detriment of balance among his nobles. Her influence divided the court between Lancastrians loyal to the king and those who feared the rise of a foreign queen dictating England's affairs. Henry's failings were most dramatically revealed in military affairs. England's grip on its territories in France, gained at great cost by his father, began to slip under his reign. Normandy was lost, and later Bordeaux fell, effectively ending English dominance in the region. These defeats were not merely territorial, they were symbolic blows to royal authority. The king's inability to manage military strategy or to select competent commanders made the monarchy appear weak and incompetent. Nobles and commoners alike began to question whether the Lancastrian king could protect England's interests at home or abroad. The king's mental instability further destabilized the realm. In August 1453, following the catastrophic defeat at Castillon, Henry VI suffered a complete mental breakdown. He became incapable of speech or movement, descending into a catatonic state that left the country effectively without a monarch. For months, governance fell entirely to his advisers, most prominently the Duke of Somerset, who seized control in the king's absence. The fragility of the throne was now physical as well as political. The monarchy's authority, already tenuous, was suspended, and England's future was suddenly uncertain. Henry's weakness emboldened his rivals, particularly Richard, Duke of York. York, whose claim to the throne was arguably stronger than Henry's, saw the king's incapacity as both a threat and an opportunity. He believed that a stronger, more decisive leader was necessary to preserve England from collapse, restore stability, and safeguard the crown from incompetence. His ambitions were not just personal, they were also framed as a mission to protect the realm. York's perspective reflected the sentiments of many nobles and members of Parliament who feared that Henry's incapacity would plunge the country into chaos. Yet Henry's fragility was not only a product of his personality or health. The structure of English governance at the time magnified his weaknesses. Authority was distributed among powerful nobles, councils, and advisers who often acted in their own self-interest. When a king could not assert himself, these factions moved independently, pursuing personal ambitions under the guise of loyalty. The crown's symbolic power remained, but its practical authority eroded. The king became a figurehead, easily manipulated and increasingly irrelevant to decision-making, leaving the nation divided and vulnerable. Even when Henry partially recovered, his inability to assert consistent authority created cycles of instability. Power would shift between rivals, decisions would be reversed, and policy would be inconsistent. Margaret of Anjou and her supporters sought to protect the Lancastrian succession, while York and his allies pressed for reform and greater influence. Every decision, every act of governance became a potential flashpoint. The throne meant to unify, now divided. England's fragile monarchy became the battleground upon which the roses would clash, and Henry VI, the king, stood as both prize and prisoner of his own weakness. In this environment, civil war was not an abstract threat. It was the logical outcome of decades of poor governance, weak leadership, and competing claims. Henry VI's reign illustrates how the fragility of a single ruler could destabilize an entire kingdom. His incapacity, both mental and political, transformed England into a nation on edge, where loyalties were contested, nobles armed themselves, and the crown itself became a contested prize. The Wars of the Roses would be fought, not only with swords and arrows, but over the very idea of legitimate authority, a concept that depended entirely on the presence of a king, strong enough to wield it. Henry VI, for all his virtues, was that king no longer. His reign exemplified the dangers of fragility at the center of power, and it set the stage for decades of violence, treachery, and civil war. England's fragile throne had become a magnet for ambition, and the red and white roses were poised to spill blood across the kingdom. From the corridors of Westminster to the fields of Yorkshire and beyond, the nation would feel the consequences of a king too weak to command, and of nobles too ambitious to restrain themselves. The fragility of Henry VI's crown was the spark that ignited the Wars of the Roses. Richard, Duke of York, stood at the center of England's storm, a man whose lineage, ambition, and timing made him both a potential savior and a threat. Born into royal blood, York was the great-grandson of Edward III, giving him a claim to the English crown that in certain eyes was even stronger than Henry VI's. Through his father, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, he descended from Edward III's fourth son, while through his mother, Anne Mortimer, he traced a line back to Edward III's second son, Lionel of Antwerp. If succession could pass through women, as some argued it should, York's claim was more direct than that of the Lancastrian king. This dynastic web made him a figure of immense potential power, but also of suspicion. York was not a reckless adventurer. He was a man shaped by the battles and politics of his time. He had spent his early years in military campaigns across France during the 100 Years' War, gaining experience, respect, and a reputation for competence. While Henry VI was gentle, scholarly, and ineffectual, York had learned the art of command, the discipline of strategy, and the reality of leadership in crisis. In a kingdom where authority had grown fragile, such qualities made him a natural focus for those dissatisfied with Henry's rule. Yet York's ambitions were carefully measured. He did not rush to claim the throne the moment he had the chance. His initial strategy was to position himself as a stabilizing force, a protector of the realm, rather than a usurper. He argued for reform, for the removal of corrupt or incompetent advisors, and for the restoration of law and order. He was respected, even admired, in some quarters because he seemed motivated by duty, not mere desire for power. The nobles who were wary of open rebellion often supported him quietly, seeing in York the strong hand that England so desperately needed. York's ambition, however, was inseparable from circumstance. By the 1450s, Henry VI's weaknesses had become painfully clear. The loss of English territories in France, the fiscal mismanagement of the crown, the favoritism shown to certain advisors, and the rise of lawless retainers created widespread unrest. Popular revolts, like Jack Cade's rebellion, exposed the deep anger of commoners and the dissatisfaction of MPs alike. York observed these failures carefully. He understood that England's problems were not just military or economic, they were structural, rooted in the absence of effective leadership at the center of power. In a way, the nation itself was asking him to act. His strategic patience was remarkable. While other nobles might have rushed to seize power in the chaos, York waited for the right moment. He returned from Ireland, where he had been appointed lieutenant, to observe the kingdom and assess his support. He cultivated alliances, particularly with influential northern families such as the Nevilles, who would become his staunchest supporters. He recognized that success depended not only on his bloodline and competence, but also on political and military backing. York's ambition was thus a mixture of dynastic entitlement, genuine concern for governance, and a careful calculation of timing. York's rivalry with the Duke of Somerset further defined his ambition. Somerset, favored by the king and queen, controlled much of the royal household and dominated military and political decisions, despite repeated failures. The loss of Normandy and other French territories under Somerset's stewardship, combined with Henry VI's reliance on the Duke, created a vacuum of confidence. York saw Somerset as both an obstacle and a symbol of the crown's failures. Removing Somerset from power became a central focus of his strategy, and York positioned himself as the man capable of restoring competence and honor to the monarchy. Despite his patience and calculation, York's claim could not remain abstract. The English crown was too weak to simply endorse competence over bloodline without challenge. York's claim to the throne, though legitimate in genealogical terms, was inherently provocative. It challenged the legitimacy of Henry VI, questioned the authority of the Lancastrian dynasty, and invited suspicion from those who feared civil war. York had to navigate this tension carefully. He needed to assert his strength and authority without appearing a usurper before the right moment arrived. York's personal character also shaped his approach. He was disciplined, cautious, and politically savvy, in contrast to many contemporaries who relied on brute force or impulsive ambition. He understood that open rebellion too early could be disastrous, and he knew that timing, alliances, and perception were as important as military strength. He built support among MPs, urban elites and the northern nobility, cultivating a network that could withstand royal resistance. His ambition, therefore, was not reckless. It was a methodical, decades-long strategy rooted in legitimacy, competence and opportunity. Yet ambition alone was not enough. The divisions in England, the entrenched rivalries and the weak crown made the country a powder keg. York's claim became more than a personal ambition. It became a focus for the grievances of nobles, commoners, and even MPs who saw in him the embodiment of authority and justice that the kingdom lacked. Supporters viewed him as a potential savior. Detractors saw him as a dangerous opportunist. The very legitimacy of his claim transformed him from a regional noble with influence to a central figure in a looming civil war. By the early 1450s, the stage was set. Henry VI's incapacity, Somerset's failures, the unrest of the Commons, and York's measured ambition converged. York had not yet drawn a sword in rebellion, but his claim, reputation, and alliances made him a force that could no longer be ignored. The question was no longer if he would act, but when, and what the consequences of that action would be. His ambition, rooted in bloodline and competence, was about to collide with the fragile crown, setting England on a path to decades of conflict and bloodshed. Richard, Duke of York, thus embodies the paradox at the heart of the Wars of the Roses, a man whose ambition was both a stabilizing force and a catalyst for civil war. His claim was legitimate, his intentions arguably for the good of the realm, yet the very act of asserting that claim threatened to tear England apart. York's life, choices and alliances were inseparable from the political, military and social currents of mid-15th century England. His ambition was not merely personal, it was structural, dynastic and inevitable, given the fragility of Henry VI's throne. When York finally raised his banner, he did so not only as a claimant, but as a symbol of the larger struggle between competence and chaos, bloodline and authority, ambition and survival. By the spring of 1450, England was a kingdom simmering with anger, frustration, and disillusionment. The loss of Normandy and other territories in France had humiliated the nation, while the king's mismanagement and the extravagance of his court left the people struggling under rising taxes and economic hardship. Merchants, farmers and commoners felt betrayed, while the nobility squabbled over lands, titles and influence. In this volatile climate, the grievances of ordinary people coalesced into a movement that would shock the kingdom: Jack Cade's rebellion. Jack Cade, a man of obscure origins, emerged as the charismatic leader of the revolt. Some claimed he was John Mortimer, invoking the name of the Mortimer family, which had a claim to the throne and was connected to York's lineage. Whether true or not, Cade capitalized on the dissatisfaction of the Commons, portraying himself as a champion of justice, ready to confront the corruption and mismanagement of the crown. His supporters called him John Amundal, a symbol of their desire to restore fairness, accountability, and order to a country they believed had been led astray by self-serving advisers and an ineffective king. The rebels articulated their grievances clearly in a manifesto that survives to this day, revealing the depth of discontent. They complained of the king's false counsel, which had allowed lawlessness and injustice to flourish, and they demanded the removal of corrupt ministers, particularly targeting the Duke of Suffolk, who had been blamed for the catastrophic losses in France. Cade's proclamation was a litany of the nation's failures: the loss of France, the loss of merchandise, the destruction of common people's livelihoods, and the king's inability to manage his own realm. It was an indictment not merely of individuals, but of the system itself, a cry for reform and justice. Cade's rebellion quickly gained momentum, drawing thousands of supporters from Kent and other southern counties. The movement was fueled by economic hardship, social unrest, and anger at the nobles who enriched themselves while ordinary people suffered. As they marched toward London, their ranks swelled with men eager to vent their frustration and take action against the crown's perceived misrule. Cade's forces were disciplined and organized, with a clear agenda, but the underlying current was one of rage, desperation, and the hope for redress. Once in London, Cady's rebels acted decisively. They seized the Guildhall, freeing prisoners from the Marshals and King's Bench jails. They looted private houses and shops, terrorizing the city's inhabitants and asserting their power. The rebels' most dramatic action came when they besieged the Tower of London, capturing and executing key royal officials, including Lord Say, the King's Treasurer, and William Cromer, the Sheriff of Kent. Their heads were displayed publicly, a grim message to the authorities and a demonstration of the rebels' determination. Initially, many in London sympathized with Cade's cause, sharing grievances against corruption and mismanagement. Even some members of the King's army showed signs of support, signaling the fragility of royal authority. However, the rebellion's success was short-lived. Once the rebels began looting and executing without restraint, public opinion shifted. Londoners, alarmed by the chaos in their city, organized their own defense. In a pitched midnight battle along London Bridge, the citizens confronted Cade's forces, driving them out and closing the gates behind them. It was not the King's army, but the people of London who ended the immediate threat, underscoring the unpredictable and volatile nature of popular uprisings. Cady himself attempted to escape, fleeing toward the south coast, but he was hunted down and killed during a skirmish near Heathfield in Sussex. His death marked the end of the rebellion, but the impact of the uprising reverberated across England. Cade's rebellion exposed the weaknesses of Henry VI's reign, the resentment toward his advisors, and the discontent among common people. It demonstrated the potential for popular movements to challenge authority, even if only temporarily, and it signaled to the nobility and the crown that decisive action or risk was necessary to maintain order. For the Duke of York, the rebellion was both a warning and an opportunity. While he was not directly involved, the chaos highlighted the consequences of Henry VI's ineffective rule and the failures of his advisors, particularly Somerset and Suffolk. York's claim to authority as a capable and legitimate leader gained new weight in the wake of Cade's revolt. The nobility and commoners alike could see in him a man capable of restoring stability, order, and a sense of justice to a kingdom teetering on the brink of anarchy. Cade's rebellion also underscored the fragile relationship between the crown, the nobility, and the commons. The king's inability to control his realm, coupled with the rise of ambitious nobles and dissatisfied citizens, created an environment where conflict was inevitable. The revolt was not merely a spontaneous eruption of violence, it was a symptom of systemic failure, a reflection of decades of mismanagement, weak kingship, and the growing assertiveness of both nobles and commoners. The English people had spoken, and their grievances could not be ignored. By the end of 1450, England was a kingdom divided along multiple lines. Dynastic disputes between York and Lancaster, noble feuds among the Percys and Nevilles, and social unrest stirred by economic hardship and governmental incompetence. Cady's rebellion served as a catalyst, crystallizing the tensions that had been simmering for years and demonstrating that the king's authority could be challenged not only by powerful nobles but by the very people he was supposed to govern. It was a moment that forced the nation to confront the consequences of weak leadership, setting the stage for the escalations that would lead directly into the Wars of the Roses. In essence, Jack Cade's rebellion was a mirror of England's vulnerabilities. It reflected the crown's failures, the nobility's ambitions, and the people's desperation. It foreshadowed the civil wars to come, highlighting that in a kingdom where the ruler is weak and the stakes are high, unrest will inevitably erupt. For York and other ambitious nobles, the rebellion served as both a lesson and an opportunity, a stark reminder that power in England could no longer be maintained by bloodline alone, and that decisive action would soon be required to secure authority, legitimacy, and control. By the autumn of 1450, the stage for open conflict was being set. England was a kingdom in disarray, still reeling from the shockwaves of Jack Cade's rebellion. The crown appeared weak, the king ineffective, and the nobility divided by personal rivalries and competing ambitions. Into this volatile mix returned Richard, Duke of York, who had spent much of the previous years in Ireland, ostensibly keeping his distance from the turmoil, yet always aware that the future of the kingdom, and perhaps the throne itself, might soon depend on him. York's return was far from triumphant. While he had been a figure of hope for the common people and reform-minded nobles during Cade's uprising, the political reality had shifted. The Duke of Somerset, previously responsible for the loss of Normandy and the subsequent military disasters in France, had stepped into the vacuum left by Suffolk's death. Somerset quickly assumed control of the king's court, regaining the trust of Henry VI and Queen Margaret, while consolidating his position among the Lancastrian loyalists. York now faced a kingdom where public sympathy for him existed in theory, but lacked practical backing from the entrenched aristocracy. York's motives were as clear as they were cautious. He did not merely wish to serve as a loyal counselor to a weak king, he aimed to restore order to a kingdom that seemed incapable of governing itself. The financial collapse, rampant corruption, and continued lawlessness demanded strong leadership, and York saw himself as the man capable of providing it. Yet, he understood the delicate balance he had to maintain. Any overt challenge to Somerset's authority risked plunging the realm into civil war, while passivity threatened the continued decline of England's political, social, and military position. The winter of 1450 to 1451 was a period of maneuvering and observation. York moved quietly at first, cultivating allies among the nobility while carefully assessing Somerset's strength. His principal support came from the powerful Neville family of northern England. The Nevilles had long-standing rivalries with other noble houses, most notably the Percys, and saw in York an opportunity to tip the balance of power in their favour. The marriage alliances and strategic landholdings of the Nevilles gave York the military backing he would need should negotiations fail, and their northern base provided a secure stronghold far from the immediate influence of Henry VI's court. Despite these advantages, York faced significant obstacles. He began to gain traction among reform-minded members of Parliament, who echoed his calls for administrative and military reform. Yet Somerset's position remained strong at court, thanks in large part to Queen Margaret's influence. As York's popularity grew in certain circles, so too did the bitterness of the Lancaster-Somerset faction. The political landscape was now polarized, with factions forming around two competing visions of governance: the Lancastrians, loyal to Henry VI and Somerset, who prioritized loyalty to the king and the preservation of existing power structures, and the Yorkists, led by York and supported by the Nevilles, who demanded reform, accountability, and a more assertive approach to defending England's interests both at home and abroad. The divisions were personal, political, and increasingly inevitable in their consequences. By early 1452, York grew impatient with the slow pace of reform. He saw no alternative but to assert his authority more forcefully. In February, he raised an army and marched south toward London, intending to pressure the king and remove Somerset from power. This was a calculated gamble. York had allies, but not enough to guarantee success. Only two major nobles openly supported him, while the rest of the aristocracy remained loyal to Henry VI. The march was meant to demonstrate strength, sway public opinion, and force concessions, but it revealed the limits of York's influence. York's campaign failed to gain the widespread support he had hoped for. The people, wary after Cade's violent uprising, were reluctant to back another armed challenge to royal authority. Even among the nobility, fear of treason charges kept potential allies on the sidelines. York's forces were ultimately insufficient to compel Somerset's removal, and the march ended in political humiliation rather than victory. York himself was captured and forced to swear an oath of loyalty to Henry VI at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. The episode left him politically isolated, his authority temporarily curtailed, and his ambitions checked. Yet the seeds of civil war had already been sown. York's failure in 1452 did not eliminate the underlying grievances or the broader tensions between noble factions. The country remained deeply divided. the king weak and incapable of governing effectively, and Somerset's position as a royal favourite increasingly resented by powerful nobles. The Nevilles and other allies of York continued to consolidate their power in the north, while regional feuds, particularly between the Nevilles and the Percys, added fuel to the growing fire. England was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark to ignite a full-scale conflict. York's return in 1450 to 1451 thus marked a turning point. York's ambitions, tempered by prudence, were now aligned with the necessity of restoring order. The next moves he made, the alliances he forged, and the confrontations that followed would determine not only his personal future but the fate of the English crown. The stage was set for the first open battles of the Wars of the Roses, and the kingdom braced itself for a struggle that would consume generations. York's return was not merely a political maneuver, it was the prelude to a war that would redefine England. The fractures in the nobility, the failures of the king, and the lingering resentment of the populace all pointed toward conflict. By the end of 1451, England was poised on the brink. The delicate balance of power was unraveling, and the stage was being set for civil war. It was only a matter of time before swords replaced words and ambition turned to bloodshed. May 22nd, 1455, dawned over the quiet town of St. Albans, yet the air was thick with tension. For years, England had simmered under the weight of political mismanagement, failed wars, and noble rivalries. Now the simmering anger had boiled over into open conflict. The first major battle of what would come to be known as the Wars of the Roses was about to be fought, and it would set the tone for decades of bloodshed and shifting loyalties. Richard, Duke of York, had returned from his earlier humiliation in London, carefully gathering allies and consolidating support from northern families, particularly the powerful Nevilles. With Somerset still entrenched in the king's favour, York knew that subtle diplomacy would achieve nothing. Action was required. His objective was clear: remove Somerset from power and assert himself as the true authority in Henry VI's court. For York, this was not merely a personal struggle, it was a fight for the survival of England under a competent government. The kingdom itself seemed to hang in the balance. While St. Albans was a modest town, its strategic position near London made it the perfect flashpoint. York's troops, well organized and motivated by grievances against the Crown's advisors, moved with purpose. The fighting was close, personal and brutal, with swords clashing and arrows flying through the tight streets. Amid the chaos, Henry VI, the weak and indecisive king, found himself in danger. Arrows rained down, and he was forced to seek refuge in a small tanner's cottage. For the first time in generations, the monarch was exposed to the raw violence of civil conflict on his own soil. The symbolic power of this moment was immense. The king, meant to embody order and authority, could only cower as his nobles battled for control of the realm. The battle turned decisively when the Earl of Warwick, the Nevilles' leading figure, signalled a change in tactics. Instead of continuing the slow advance through the streets, York's forces launched a concentrated assault from the rear, breaking the Lancastrian lines and routing them. The fighting soon spilled into the marketplace, where panic gripped the defenders. Somerset, aware of the danger and the vengeance that awaited him, chose to fight to the death. Contemporary accounts describe him swinging his sword fiercely, killing several men before being overwhelmed. His death marked the first significant casualty of the conflict and sent a clear message: in this war, no quarter would be asked, no mercy given. Other prominent Lancastrians also fell that day. Lord Clifford, a staunch supporter of the Lancastrian cause, and the Earl of Northumberland were among the dead. These losses were not just tactical but symbolic. The nobility had begun to understand that England was entering an era where personal vendettas, political ambitions, and family rivalries would determine the fate of the kingdom. The death of Somerset and other key figures signalled a shift in power. York had emerged victorious, and the Lancastrian faction was shaken to its core. The battle demonstrated that the authority of the king could be directly challenged by his nobles. The long-standing feudal loyalty that had held the kingdom together for centuries was no longer guaranteed. St. Albans had not ended the conflict. It had merely transformed political tensions into an open, bloody war. St. Albans also set a precedent for the nature of the Wars of the Roses. Future battles would be marked by personal vendettas, family alliances, and the shifting loyalties of the nobility. The war would be as much about settling scores as it was about the crown. The conflict was no longer abstract. It was immediate, visceral, and terrifyingly close to home for ordinary people who found themselves caught between rival armies and noble ambitions. By the end of the day, the first major battle had concluded, but the repercussions would resonate for decades. York's success emboldened his allies and gave momentum to the Yorkist cause, yet it also deepened the divisions within the kingdom, ensuring that reconciliation between Yorkists and Lancastrians was impossible. England had crossed a threshold. Civil war was now a reality, and the kingdom would never be the same. The Battle of St. Albans was, in essence, the spark that ignited the Wars of the Roses. It demonstrated the deadly consequences of political mismanagement, noble rivalries, and a king incapable of asserting authority. With the first blood of the Civil War spilled, England entered a period of unprecedented instability, where loyalty, power, and ambition would collide in a struggle that would claim princes, dukes, and common soldiers alike. The stage was set for decades of conflict, and the country was left to wonder who would ultimately claim the blood-stained crown of England. After the shock of St. Albans, England's fragile peace shattered completely. The first battle had proven that the crown could no longer guarantee authority. Richard, Duke of York, now emerged as the dominant force, but his victory was far from the end of conflict. The Lancastrians had suffered a blow, but their cause was far from dead. King Henry VI remained alive, and with him the loyalty of powerful nobles who still held lands, armies, and grudges. Over the next decades, England would be trapped in a deadly seesaw of power, with Yorkists and Lancastrians jockeying for control, each trying to outmaneuver the other, each willing to spill blood to achieve supremacy. York's strategy after St. Albans was cautious but deliberate. He assumed the role of England's de facto ruler, steering policy through the weak king, consolidating support among the northern families, particularly the Nevilles, and attempting to bring the kingdom under some measure of order. Yet his power was contested at every turn. Queen Margaret of Anjou, newly politically awakened and fiercely protective of her infant son Edward, became a rallying point for Lancastrian resistance. She was a formidable opponent, ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless when required. Margaret's rise marked a turning point. The Lancastrians were no longer passive, reactionary figures. They became active players, willing to use armies and alliances to counter Yorkist dominance. The next decade saw a pattern that would define the Wars of the Roses. Yorkist victories would be met with Lancastrian resurgence. Battles were punctuated by political maneuvering, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. The nobles were as much participants as the kings themselves, each family seeking advantage, each marriage and inheritance a potential cause for conflict. The Nevilles, who had backed York, used his authority to secure lands and titles, often at the expense of the Percys, traditional Lancastrian supporters in the north. These personal feuds escalated local conflicts into national crises. Meanwhile, Henry VI proved incapable of asserting himself. His periods of mental instability left a power vacuum that neither side could resist exploiting. When he was lucid, he was indecisive, unable to rein in ambitious nobles or restore confidence in the crown. When he was incapacitated, the kingdom was effectively ruled by whichever faction could seize control. In this environment, every council, every parliament, became a battlefield of influence. York's supporters would push for reforms, demanding that mismanaged lands and revenues be restored, while Lancastrian loyalists resisted, attempting to preserve the influence of the king's household and Margaret's growing network of allies. The tension between York and Margaret became particularly acute after 1453, when Henry VI's mental collapse became permanent. With the king incapacitated, Margaret assumed control of the Lancastrian faction, mobilizing resources and fortifying her son's claim. York, aware that the line of succession still included him as heir presumptive if Edward were to die prematurely, intensified his maneuvering. The political chessboard became a game of life and death, with each side positioning its pieces. Castles were garrisoned, armies raised, alliances forged across the country. London, the north, and the Welsh borders all became theatres in this grand, deadly struggle. Yorkists and Lancastrians alike understood that timing was everything. Any hesitation could mean losing crucial support, while overreach could provoke open rebellion. Skirmishes and raids became common, even during periods of supposed peace. The nobility, sensing weakness in the king, often acted independently, bringing their own armies into the field, and sometimes escalating minor disputes into full-scale confrontations. The nation itself teetered on the edge of chaos, with ordinary citizens caught in the crossfire of aristocratic ambition. One of the key features of this period was the fluidity of alliances. Families like the Nevilles and Percys switched sides when it suited their interests. Marriages were arranged to secure loyalties, and even minor nobles could tip the balance of local power. Yorkist and Lancastrian labels were clear in theory, but in practice the battlefield was constantly shifting. Today's ally might become tomorrow's enemy, and the crown, meant to be the symbol of unity, became the prize over which these battles were fought. Despite the bloodshed, the struggle was not simply about brute force. York and Margaret both understood the importance of political legitimacy. York often justified his actions through appeals to justice, condemning the mismanagement of France and the corruption of Henry's councillors. Margaret framed her actions as the defence of her son, the rightful heir, portraying York as an opportunist seeking to usurp the crown. These narratives were not propaganda in the modern sense. They were existential arguments, designed to sway nobles, soldiers, and commoners alike. Victory in battle alone was insufficient. Public perception and loyalty were equally vital. Throughout the 1450s and 1460s, England was caught in this cycle of confrontation. Battles were won and lost, key figures killed or imprisoned, and the political landscape continually reshaped. The Lancastrians regained momentum at times, only to be checked by Yorkist counterattacks. York himself would be killed in the field in 1460, yet his claim did not die with him. His sons Edward and Richard continued the fight, demonstrating that this was not just a struggle between individuals, but between dynastic claims, family honor, and the control of the kingdom itself. The long struggle highlighted the fragility of medieval monarchy when combined with weak leadership and ambitious nobility. Henry VI's inability to assert control created a vacuum that his subjects filled with violence, intrigue, and treachery. Yet despite the chaos, a pattern emerged. Power shifted between Yorkist and Lancastrian hands, not through formal succession or law, but through military action, strategic marriages, and political acumen. The Wars of the Roses were a relentless interplay of these elements, a deadly dance of ambition and survival that would shape England for the rest of the century. By the end of this phase, it was clear that neither side could claim permanent dominance. Every Yorkist victory inspired a Lancastrian resurgence. Every Lancastrian rally provoked Yorkist retaliation. England was locked in a civil war with no clear end, each faction convinced of its own legitimacy and prepared to sacrifice everything to see its cause prevail. The kingdom itself became a living battlefield, and the lessons of loyalty, strategy, and ruthlessness learned here would echo in the battles to come. The long struggle between Yorkists and Lancastrians was not only about crowns and claims, it was about survival, honor, and the assertion of power in a kingdom where the line between justice and ambition was dangerously thin. As the battles raged and families turned against one another, the stage was set for the eventual rise of a new dynasty, one that would emerge from the chaos, claiming the throne in the blood-soaked conclusion of the Wars of the Roses. England's streets were quiet, but beneath the surface, tension roiled like a storm about to break. The Duke of York had fallen, but his legacy did not die with him. His eldest son, Edward, now poised and determined, stepped into a world carved by blood and betrayal. The mantle of Yorkist leadership passed to a young man who would not hesitate, who understood that caution alone would not win a crown. Edward was different from his father, confident, charismatic, and ruthless when he needed to be. He had watched the failures of Henry VI's reign, the chaos unleashed by weak kingship, and the endless ambitions of nobles. He knew that if the Yorkist claim were to survive, it required action, decisiveness, and a willingness to wield power without hesitation. The kingdom was fractured. The Lancastrians had regrouped, their forces scattered across the north and the west, loyal to Queen Margaret and her son, Edward of Westminster. But they were weary. Years of conflict had drained men, money, and morale, and Edward understood how to turn that fatigue into opportunity. He moved swiftly, gathering support among northern families loyal to the Nevilles, securing strategic castles, and rallying troops with promises of justice, vengeance, and the restoration of order. In March of 1460, Edward's campaign took shape. With the calculated audacity of a master strategist, he marched south. Every step was deliberate. Every message sent, every alliance forged, was a chess move designed to weaken Lancastrian influence. Edward's charisma drew men to him. Soldiers who had fought under York now followed his banner with renewed purpose. Nobles who had remained cautious now chose sides, sensing that the tide of fortune was shifting. And Edward, aware of this, prepared for the battles that would define his reign. He was not just a soldier, he was a leader, a figure around whom men could rally, a symbol of a cause that had survived decades of bloodshed. By 1461, Edward IV, as he would soon be crowned, had transformed the Yorkist cause from a disputed claim into a force that could shape the fate of England. His rise was not only a personal triumph, but a turning point in the Wars of the Roses. He brought vision, decisiveness, and a rare combination of charm and ruthlessness. The throne was within his reach, but the path was littered with enemies, loyalties tested, and the lingering resentment of families whose bloodlines had been challenged, humiliated, or destroyed. Edward's ascendancy marked a new chapter. It was a moment of hope for some, terror for others, and inevitability for all. The crown, long contested, seemed poised to change hands at last. But civil war, as England would soon discover, was rarely neat. Victory on one battlefield did not guarantee peace. Edward understood this. Every victory required vigilance. Every ally required attention. Every rival, whether noble or commoner, demanded respect or the sword. And so, with the crown almost within reach, Edward IV prepared to strike. The stage was set for the battles that would decide the fate of a kingdom, the legacy of families, and the course of a civil war that had haunted England for over 3 decades. His rise was swift, but the path ahead was as treacherous as it had ever been. The Wars of the Roses were far from over, and Edward IV was determined to ensure that, this time, Yorkist power would endure. January 1461. The air was bitter, thick with smoke, and the metallic tang of blood. England had not known such uncertainty for decades. Edward IV had claimed momentum, but a crown was not secured through promises alone. Battles had to be fought. Battles had to be won. The first of these defining clashes came at Mortimer's Cross. Edward faced not just armies, but the weight of history, the ghosts of his father's failures, the cries of the fallen, the doubt of those who still questioned Yorkist legitimacy. Yet he rode forward with courage that inspired men. His forces, outnumbered but disciplined, pressed against the Lancastrians led by Owen Tudor and other loyalists to Henry VI. The morning sky darkened with clouds, and then with arrows. The clash of steel echoed through the valley. Edward's troops held firm, countering every assault with precision. The young duke moved among them, his presence a rallying point. He did not simply command, he led. The battle turned in Edward's favour when a sudden tactical manoeuvre split the enemy lines. The Lancastrians wavered, then broke. Victory was claimed, not through luck, but through the audacity, strategy, and determination of Edward IV. Yet Mortimer's cross was only the beginning. Across England, Lancastrian forces regrouped, and a larger confrontation loomed. The battle that would truly cement Edward's claim came at Towton in March of 1461. It was one of the bloodiest battles England had ever seen. The snow fell, mingling with the blood of soldiers, the frozen ground turning into a quagmire of death and despair. Men fought not just for king or crown, but for survival, for honour, for the future of their families. Edward rode at the front, undeterred by the chaos around him. Arrows rained, swords clashed, and cries of anguish echoed across the fields. The Yorkist archers unleashed a storm that decimated the Lancastrian lines. Edward's strategic brilliance became apparent. Flanking manoeuvres, coordinated assaults, relentless pressure. By the day's end, thousands lay dead, and the Lancastrian forces were shattered. The blood of countless men soaked the frozen soil, marking a grim testament to the cost of ambition and civil war. Towton did more than win a battle. It changed the course of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI was forced to flee, leaving the throne to Edward IV. Yet the victory carried a haunting weight. Families were torn apart, noble houses extinguished. The cost of power was made tangible, visible in the frozen, blood-soaked fields. Edward's triumph was absolute, but England's wounds were deep and raw. Edward IV did not revel in the bloodshed. He understood the fragility of power, how quickly the tide could turn. He moved swiftly to consolidate his reign, securing key castles, negotiating with wavering nobles, and rewarding those loyal to the Yorkist cause. Yet his actions were tempered by necessity. England was fractured. Loyalties were tenuous. The shadow of the Lancastrians, led by Margaret of Anjou, lingered, plotting and gathering strength in the west and south. Victory at Mortimer's Cross and Towton made Edward IV a king, but the battles were more than military triumphs. They were symbols of a new order. Yorkist power was no longer a claim, it was reality. Yet even as he celebrated, Edward knew that survival required vigilance. The Wars of the Roses were far from over. Every ally could be a potential traitor. Every defeated Lancastrian could rise again. Every misstep could plunge England back into chaos. Edward IV's rise was meteoric, but it was forged in blood, strategy, and relentless ambition. The battles that cemented his power were not just historical events. They were moments of transformation. They reshaped the kingdom, redrew the lines of loyalty, and left an indelible mark on England's memory. And so, as Edward IV ascended the throne fully, crowned in the aftermath of Towton's carnage, the Yorkist dynasty seemed secure, yet the fires of rebellion still smouldered, and the Wars of the Roses, with all their bitterness, intrigue, and tragedy, were far from over. England had a king, but the kingdom itself remained a battlefield, not just of armies, but of hearts, loyalties, and legacies. March 1461. The crown had been claimed by Edward IV, but Henry VI was not yet defeated. The weak, pious king fled into the shadows of England, a man haunted by his own failures, and yet a symbol around which the Lancastrian cause could rally. Margaret of Anjou, the indomitable queen, took charge. She was fierce, resolute, and unyielding. Her husband was lost to Yorkist power, her son a boy king yet to see his inheritance. But Margaret did not despair. She gathered what remained of their forces in the west, calling upon loyal nobles, rallying soldiers who still believed in Lancaster, and rekindling hope in a war-weary population. The flight of Henry VI was not a simple retreat. It was a strategic withdrawal into the heartlands, where Lancastrian loyalty remained strong. Every mile he travelled, he left behind devastation wrought by war, towns burned, fields scarred, and refugees fleeing. Yet his survival was essential. The king was the living embodiment of Lancastrian legitimacy. Without him, the crown could belong to Edward IV, but the cause itself would wither. Margaret moved swiftly, rallying armies in Wales and the north. She inspired her followers not through strategy alone, but through sheer force of personality. Her speeches were fiery, her presence commanding. Nobles and soldiers alike felt that she carried the spirit of Lancaster in every word, in every gesture. She reminded them of the blood that had been spilled, of fathers, sons and brothers lost, and she demanded justice, vengeance and reclamation of the throne. By summer 1461, the Lancastrian resistance was reorganized. From the shadows they struck at Yorkist positions, harassing supply lines, attacking small garrisons and spreading fear. England was far from peaceful. Towns whispered rumors of rebellion. Markets were tense with uncertainty. And through it all, Margaret's determination kept her army cohesive. Henry VI remained a fragile figure, a king in exile. He did not command armies with the decisiveness of Edward IV, but his presence mattered. It was his name that rallied men, his claim that legitimized uprisings. And yet there was a tragic poignancy in his flight, a king powerless to rule, yet central to the survival of his house. The resistance was not only military. Margaret's court became a center of plotting, negotiation, and alliances. She reached across borders, seeking support from France and Scotland. Every meeting, every alliance, every whispered plan was an attempt to turn the tide. The Yorkists had the throne, but the Lancastrians had the loyalty of the people, the legacy of bloodlines, and the unshakable will of a queen determined to restore her family's honor. Even in defeat, hope persisted. In the north and west, bands of soldiers loyal to Lancaster harassed Edward's forces. Skirmishes flared, castles changed hands, and the war raged on. Margaret's leadership made it clear Edward IV might wear the crown, but the heart of England remained divided. And so, England entered a precarious chapter. The crown was won, but the war was far from over. Margaret and Henry VI embodied the Lancastrian flame, flickering yet unextinguished. Their resistance would continue to shape the battles, the alliances and the betrayals that defined the Wars of the Roses. Every step of Henry's flight, every rally of Margaret's forces, carried the weight of history, the fragile hope of a dynasty on the brink, and the reminder that a crown is not simply taken, but constantly fought for. Edward IV sat upon the throne of England. The crown was heavy, not just with gold, but with the weight of expectation, the blood of thousands, and the fragile loyalty of a fractured kingdom. Victory at Towton had secured Yorkist power, at least for the moment. But England was far from stable. The land was scarred by years of civil war. Villages burned, fields abandoned, nobles bitterly divided. The common people whispered of unrest. Every corner of the realm seemed to tremble with uncertainty. Edward knew that to hold the crown was not enough. Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI remained alive, still symbols of hope for those who opposed York. In the north, in the west, and even in pockets of the south, small uprisings threatened the fragile peace. Edward's forces moved quickly, crushing insurrections, but the victories were costly, and each battle left new scars. Within the court, the struggle for power was just as fierce. Nobles jockeyed for influence, seeking positions, lands and favor. Edward had to balance their ambitions, rewarding loyalty while keeping potential traitors in check. The Nevilles, powerful and ambitious, were invaluable allies, but their support came with expectations. The Percys, bitter rivals, had not vanished. Every decision Edward made had consequences, and a misstep could turn allies into enemies overnight. Edward himself was no tyrant. He was intelligent, charismatic, and often generous, but he was also aware of the fragility of his rule. He moved with caution, calculated, knowing that the crown was won by the sword, but held by strategy. Every act of governance, every marriage arranged, every alliance forged, was a step toward consolidating Yorkist power, and yet fear never left him. He understood the nature of the Wars of the Roses. The throne could be won, but it could just as easily be lost. Loyalties shifted like sand. Yesterday's friend could become today's enemy. One false move, and the entire kingdom could erupt into chaos once again. Edward's rule was therefore a delicate dance. He rebuilt castles, reinforced garrisons, and strengthened his household. He sought the counsel of trusted allies and kept a careful eye on Lancastrian activity. England's economy, weakened by years of war, required attention. Taxes had to be collected, trade revived, and the scars of famine and loss addressed. Despite his victories, the crown brought no rest. Every night, Edward must have lain awake, thinking of Henry VI in exile, of Margaret plotting in the shadows, of nobles who whispered in corridors, of the blood-soaked fields of Mortimer's Cross and Towton. Each moment of peace was temporary, every victory provisional. And yet, in the midst of chaos, Edward IV began to build the foundations of stability. Yorkist banners flew across England. Castles were garrisoned. Orders were enforced. Slowly, the sense of law and authority returned, though always fragile, always threatened. The crown, once claimed through battle, now required governance, wisdom, and constant vigilance. Edward IV had won the war, but he understood that the real struggle, the struggle to secure England, had only just begun. The Yorkist reign, though victorious, was far from secure. Edward IV ruled, yet shadows of rebellion lingered across England. The crown sat upon his head, but the kingdom itself remained restless, torn between loyalty and resentment, between memory and ambition. And then the unimaginable happened. Henry VI, the fragile, pious king who had once fled for his life, returned, not as a simple figurehead, but as a symbol, a living embodiment of Lancastrian legitimacy. His arrival reignited old loyalties, old grievances, and the simmering anger that had never fully faded from the hearts of those who had lost lands, sons, or honor during Yorkist victories. Margaret of Anjou had not abandoned hope. She worked tirelessly behind the scenes, forging alliances, whispering promises of justice and vengeance. Every move she made reminded Edward IV and his supporters that the crown, though claimed by the sword, was never truly secure. The return of Henry VI fractured the realm further. Nobles who had once sworn allegiance to Edward began to hesitate. Some defected, swayed by loyalty, fear, or the hope of advantage. Others remained steadfast, but their certainty was tested at every turn. England, long scarred by war, teetered once more on the edge of chaos. The king himself, Edward, understood the danger. He had fought for the throne, won the crown, yet he could not fight alone. Every decision carried weight. Every battle, political or military, could tip the scales. The factions within his own court, rivalries, jealousies, ambitions, became as dangerous as any Lancastrian army. Henry VI's return also had an emotional toll on Edward. The Yorkist king had spent years consolidating power, winning battles, and claiming legitimacy through force. Now he faced a rival who had survived exile, who embodied the history and lineage that many still revered. The young Edward had to navigate not only strategy and war, but perception, loyalty, and the deep, unyielding currents of dynastic belief. As Henry's forces gathered, England felt the weight of history pressing down. Villages remembered Towton, Mortimer's Cross, St. Albans. Families mourned lost sons, and others whispered of revenge. The Wars of the Roses were no longer distant battles. They were present in every hearth, every street, every castle. Edward IV had to respond with strength, wisdom, and resolve. Yorkist forces were marshalled, alliances renewed, and spies sent to track Henry's movements. The crown demanded vigilance. Any lapse could embolden the Lancastrians, could inspire rebellion, and could shatter Yorkist authority in an instant. And yet, there was a strange, almost tragic symmetry in Henry's return. A man who had once been powerless now wielded influence simply through his existence. The wars that had defined England for decades were not just fought on the battlefield, they were fought in hearts, in loyalties, in the fragile balance between fear, hope and duty. For Edward IV, the lesson was clear: victory in battle did not mean victory in life. The crown could be seized, but its security depended on more than sword and shield. It required cunning, patience, and the unyielding will to face rivals, both living and symbolic. Henry VI's return reminded all of England that the Wars of the Roses were not over. The struggle for the crown was relentless, brutal, and unforgiving. And in the midst of this turmoil, every man, every woman, every noble and soldier would be tested by loyalty, by ambition, and by the ever-turning wheel of fate. August 22nd, 1485. The fields near Bosworth lay quiet under the early morning mist. England had been torn apart for decades. Generations of noble blood spilled across its soil. Families divided, fortunes destroyed, crowns claimed and lost. And now, the final chapter was about to be written. Henry Tudor, a man with a claim to the Lancastrian line, faced King Richard III, the last Yorkist king. 2 men, 2 armies, and the hopes of a kingdom rested on a single day. The tension was unbearable. Soldiers waited, hearts pounding, the distant cries of commanders slicing through the heavy morning air. The ground trembled under the march of horses. Every man knew that this battle would decide more than a crown. It would decide the fate of England itself. Richard III, proud, defiant, desperate, rode at the front of his forces. His armor gleamed, his banners snapped in the wind, and his eyes burned with determination. He knew that if he fell, the Yorkist dynasty would end. Every sword raised against him, every arrow loosed, was a potential end to centuries of Yorkist ambition. Henry Tudor, calm yet resolute, rallied his troops. He carried the hopes of Lancaster, the survival of his claim, and the chance for a new beginning. His forces were smaller, less experienced, but his purpose was unshakable. He would fight not just for the crown, but for the promise of peace after decades of war. The battle began with thunderous clashes. Horses screamed. Men cried out in pain and fury. Arrows darkened the sky. The sound of steel, striking steel, echoed across the fields. For hours, the 2 sides met again and again, neither yielding, neither broken. Richard charged forward, attempting to break Henry's center. He fought with the fury of a man who knew the crown was at stake. His knights fell around him. The ground became a chaos of mud, blood and steel. And then betrayal. Some of Richard's allies, swayed by promises or fear, turned against him. The tide of battle shifted in an instant. In the heart of the melee, Richard III found himself surrounded, his forces scattered. He fought valiantly, every swing of his sword a defiance against fate itself, but it was not enough. With a final desperate cry, he fell. The last Yorkist king had been struck down on the battlefield. Henry Tudor emerged victorious. He was crowned Henry VII, uniting the warring houses through marriage to Elizabeth of York. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were joined, symbolizing the end of decades of bloodshed. England exhaled. The Wars of the Roses, a period marked by betrayal, slaughter, and fragile loyalties, had finally come to an end. A new dynasty began, but the memory of the conflict would never fade. Every scar on the land, every family torn apart, every crown contested was a reminder of the cost of ambition and the price of power. The Battle of Bosworth was not just the fall of a king. It was the close of a chapter in English history, defined by rivalry, courage, and tragedy. The Wars of the Roses had shaped a nation, forged a new dynasty, and left a legacy that would be remembered for centuries. Henry VII's crown was secure, but the lessons of Bosworth lingered. In England, power is fleeting, loyalty is fragile, and the pursuit of the throne is never without blood. Yorkist forces were marshalled, alliances renewed, and spies sent to track Henry's movements. The crown demanded vigilance. Any lapse could embolden the Lancastrians, could inspire rebellion, and could shatter Yorkist authority in an instant. And yet, there was a strange, almost tragic symmetry in Henry's return. A man who had once been powerless now wielded influence simply through his existence. The wars that had defined England for decades were not just fought on the battlefield, they were fought in hearts, in loyalties, in the fragile balance between fear, hope and duty. For Edward IV, the lesson was clear: victory in battle did not mean victory in life. The crown could be seized, but its security depended on more than sword and shield. It required cunning, patience, and the unyielding will to face rivals, both living and symbolic. Henry VI's return reminded all of England that the Wars of the Roses were not over. The struggle for the crown was relentless, brutal, and unforgiving. And in the midst of this turmoil, every man, every woman, every noble and soldier would be tested by loyalty, by ambition, and by the ever-turning wheel of fate. August 22nd, 1485. The fields near Bosworth lay quiet under the early morning mist. England had been torn apart for decades. Generations of noble blood spilled across its soil. Families divided, fortunes destroyed, crowns claimed and lost. And now, the final chapter was about to be written. Henry Tudor, a man with a claim to the Lancastrian line, faced King Richard III, the last Yorkist king. 2 men, 2 armies, and the hopes of a kingdom rested on a single day. The tension was unbearable. Soldiers waited, hearts pounding, the distant cries of commanders slicing through the heavy morning air. The ground trembled under the march of horses. Every man knew that this battle would decide more than a crown. It would decide the fate of England itself. Richard III, proud, defiant, desperate, rode at the front of his forces. His armor gleamed, his banners snapped in the wind, and his eyes burned with determination. He knew that if he fell, the Yorkist dynasty would end. Every sword raised against him, every arrow loosed, was a potential end to centuries of Yorkist ambition. Henry Tudor, calm yet resolute, rallied his troops. He carried the hopes of Lancaster, the survival of his claim, and the chance for a new beginning. His forces were smaller, less experienced, but his purpose was unshakable. He would fight not just for the crown, but for the promise of peace after decades of war. The battle began with thunderous clashes. Horses screamed. Men cried out in pain and fury. Arrows darkened the sky. The sound of steel, striking steel, echoed across the fields. For hours, the 2 sides met again and again, neither yielding, neither broken. Richard charged forward, attempting to break Henry's center. He fought with the fury of a man who knew the crown was at stake. His knights fell around him. The ground became a chaos of mud, blood and steel. And then betrayal. Some of Richard's allies, swayed by promises or fear, turned against him. The tide of battle shifted in an instant. In the heart of the melee, Richard III found himself surrounded, his forces scattered. He fought valiantly, every swing of his sword a defiance against fate itself, but it was not enough. With a final desperate cry, he fell. The last Yorkist king had been struck down on the battlefield. Henry Tudor emerged victorious. He was crowned Henry VII, uniting the warring houses through marriage to Elizabeth of York. The red rose of Lancaster and the white rose of York were joined, symbolizing the end of decades of bloodshed. England exhaled. The Wars of the Roses, a period marked by betrayal, slaughter, and fragile loyalties, had finally come to an end. A new dynasty began, but the memory of the conflict would never fade. Every scar on the land, every family torn apart, every crown contested was a reminder of the cost of ambition and the price of power. The Battle of Bosworth was not just the fall of a king. It was the close of a chapter in English history defined by rivalry, courage, and tragedy. The Wars of the Roses had shaped a nation, forged a new dynasty, and left a legacy that would be remembered for centuries. Henry VII's crown was secure, but the lessons of Bosworth lingered. In England, power is fleeting, loyalty is fragile, and the pursuit of the throne is never without blood.